Hello there, I'm Carmelo from Nick and Melo's Hyperspace. You know what that means. It means like our videos, if you like our videos. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can be notified every time we upload a program. May the force be with you.
You are now entering Nick and Melo's hyperspace.
I'm Nick, and I really love Ventress' story and Dark Disciple and her inclusion in Dooku Jedi Lost.
And I'm Carmelo, and I love the trajectory of Ahsoka, the many places in which we see all of the different layers of her story.
In our journey through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young and one old, who come together through the will of the Force.
In this episode, we're going to be doing a character study of two characters, actually, that we have found intriguing, interesting, fascinating, fun, wonderful: Ahsoka Tano and Asajj Ventress. And Nick, I think we should start the conversation talking a little bit about why these two characters and what are the sort of the many points, the many levels of interest that these two characters create in the shows and the books and the comics and everywhere.
Yeah, so there's multiple reasons I love these characters besides being amazing. They are probably two of the more popular, Ahsoka especially, the more popular animated characters from their animated series that are very celebrated and very loved. There are also two women in Star Wars that are not named Leia, so they get a lot of screen time and a lot of layers of complexity added to them. So we get to see their transition and their journey. So that's to me, I think, why we wanted to highlight them and discuss them, because they're like I said, they're very beloved, but we kind of find them similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there are many parallels. I also like the fact that these are two characters that have become sort of a really important part of the Star Wars lore, but they're not part of the Skywalker saga of the 9 films.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there has been historically this tendency of creating a hierarchy about, the movies are the thing, and now maybe because of The Mandalorian, the televisions are the thing too. And I love how these are two characters that were created outside of that film story. And at the same time, they are quintessential Star Wars. That's another really important thing that they bring onto it, because it sort of makes us realize that Star Wars is consumed and created in many, many media, and not just in one little thing. And so that's another attraction about the two of them. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and this is something that I mentioned to you in the past, they're Clone War babies. These are women that come into being, that come into adulthood during the Clone Wars and the aftermath of the Clone Wars. And it's interesting to see how they react in very different ways about what the society and the culture of that moment is affecting them in very real ways. And they're both connected to the Force.
Right.
In different ways, which is sort of fun. And this is my knee, so don't be afraid. It's just my knee. I'm just getting cozy here in the podcast today. Do you remember the first time you saw Ahsoka?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't see the Clone Wars movie that came to theaters. But that's where her introduction was. I don't remember the first episode I watched of Clone Wars, to be honest with you, but I just remember her, and I think that this is probably common for a lot of people. I didn't really care for her in the beginning. She just seemed like a regular, generic, right along teenage character. She, to me, didn't bring nothing to the table that I thought was very interesting at first, and then I guess as the series progressed, she kind of grew up with the audience, and she's really like I said, the point of view character. So we get to experience that growth with her, and then by the end of season 5, we're totally invested. We're on the edge of our seats, waiting to see how she's going to get out of this one, and she's going to go next. She was one that I don't remember when I initially saw her, but I do remember that experiencing that slowly but surely. I was like, I do like her. Yeah, she's very interesting. Yeah, it kind of It was funny how that worked out.
I, like you, I did not see the film first. I saw the show first. And I must have seen season 1 first. So I was introduced in Ahsoka in season 1 of Clone Wars. And so it is interesting to see that first and then go back to the feisty little girl that comes out of that ship. And Anakin is like, she's my what? But it is true that she is, it's really interesting. She's one of the characters that I think develops the most in Clone Wars. More than Kenobi and Anakin. Kenobi and Anakin are there as we know who they are, we know what happens to them, we sort of have the story. But with Ahsoka, we don't. And so this is the first time that we are seeing her, and we're seeing her grow up, and we're seeing her develop. And one of the things that I mentioned in my book is that in Clone Wars, in a way, Ahsoka is the person that is holding our hands, trying to understand the Jedi, trying to understand the function of the Jedi in the Clone Wars, trying to understand the nature of war, and how it relates to these peacekeepers that she's training to be. And so she becomes, for me, she becomes my channel. She becomes my bridge to understanding the war and to understanding the Jedi in the function of the war. And to me, that's really important. Really, 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 really important. And I don't know if this was the intention of the show or not. I'm not friends with Filoni, so I can't ask him right now. But I think she functions very much as sort of our introduction to enter that world. Ventress is another $20 because to me, she shows up as a almost one-dimensional evil character in Clone Wars. And as we go, like Ahsoka, we get more and more layers. And by the end of season 5, I am completely fascinated by Ventress by the end.
I'm glad you mentioned her introduction. We get a little variance of her introduction in the 2 different Clone Wars series, the 2003 and then the 2008. Right. The 2003 I'm not as familiar with, but I went back and watched it, and I noticed some interesting changes they made when they adapted her to the later version of Clone Wars. They, in the later version of Clone Wars, she doesn't know who Palpatine is at all. She knows that Dooku has a master, but she doesn't know what he looks like, doesn't know anything about him. She just knows that, Dooku is the big bad, but then there's somebody above him that's even scarier, and she's kind of, not sure who that is and kind of weary. But then I watched the introduction of her in the 2003 version, and when Dooku is, giving her sabers and explaining, we need you, we need more than a spy, we need an assassin, really. Right. He just brings out a hologram. He's like, okay, so here's my master, here he is, and Palpatine's like, well, hey, it's like a training, like an introduction to a new workplace. It's like, well, welcome to our company. It's very strange.
Congratulations, you got the job.
We're a family here, and so it's a little strange.
And I like very much how you're pointing out the differences between the two, because in Clone Wars, she shows up in the first episode. She is the emissary of Dooku for I think it's called Ambush, the very first episode. But it's really interesting how in the Filoni's Clone Wars, in the Clone Wars, you get already Asajj Ventress established as somebody in league with Dooku. While in the Tartakovsky animated mini episodes, what you get is how she shows up, like how Dooku and Asajj Ventress actually connect. And one of the things that I like about having them both, in that there are differences and there are variants between them, but they're not necessarily contradicting each other, because we never see when Dooku is sort of meeting Ahsoka, except in that flashback that we get at the very end. of the Clone Wars show when she is sort of I don't remember the episode or the season, but there's this like gigantic, amazing flashback about getting to know who Ventress is.
You talking about the one where it's kind of like her origin, where the Night Sisters have to give her up, and then she gets found by Chimeric, and then okay, yeah. So from my understanding, the way it sounded, and I had recently watched them, but my memory's fuzzy already. The
welcome to getting old.
The episode that they kind of discuss her origin, I think at the end, this is when at that point in Clone Wars, Dooku kind of is told by Sidious we don't need her anymore, get rid of her, she's a liability. So the Night Sister, she goes to Dathomir and kind of obviously she is a Night Sister, so they're going to kind of keep this a secret from Dooku, and he comes to them and says, this time I want a male, or they offer him a male, like one of them. And then in the origin, the flashback we see of her, she's given away to, looks like slavers. And then the slavers are killed by Chimeric, her Jedi master, and then he trains her, and then he gets killed by a bounty hunter, and then she kind of, I guess we don't really see what happens after that, where she goes, but we just know ultimately she ends up with Dooku and kind of turns to the dark side. So we don't know exactly where it is. So there's a little bit of holes, but I found that interesting that it sounds like that Dooku in the 03 version, he just happened chance to find her, and then this one it kind of sounds like it was planned a little bit.
Yeah.
And Palpatine knew about it, but I guess that's why the rule of two little thing that the Sith live by, she doesn't quite apply. I guess she's not technically a Sith; she's more of an assassin. And so it was just interesting to see that, because they took the liberty of kind of taking their time. It's like let's change this a little bit instead of just just rehashing something we've already seen. So I thought that was neat.
And it's really interesting what you're pointing out, because both Ahsoka and Ventress are going through transformations to the degree that sometimes it's difficult to label them. There are all these online conversations like, is Ahsoka a Jedi or not? Because she was a Padawan, but she left the Jedi but she's still using the Force. She has lightsabers. There are all of these sort of like, and the same thing happens with Ventress, with this idea of, how much of her is an assassin, how much of her is a Night Sister, how much of her is she really a Sith or not. I like that a lot. You can't just say, oh, she's this. Neither of them are one thing. They are in between things, or they are many things at the same time, which in the world of Star Wars makes them, to me, even more fascinating.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, throughout the series, they don't ever refer to Ventress as a Sith. The Jedi always say, that's Dooku's assassin, or she's an assassin, or something like that. So I guess the Jedi don't even view her as Sith.
But she thinks of herself as an heir to the Sith. She thinks of herself as somebody who is training to be a Sith.
Right.
And so to me, that's a really interesting phenomenon, that she might not be thought of a Sith by either Palpatine or Dooku, but she thinks of herself as one.
Right.
While Ahsoka has renounced the Jedi Order, but the name of the episode in The Mandalorian is called The Jedi. And so there's this really interesting notion about representation, about how do they see themselves
versus
how others see them. In the case of Ahsoka and in the case of Ventress, that I find really interesting.
Yeah, back to the Mandalorian, the episode called The Jedi. I think beforehand, when he meets up with Bo-Katan, I think, does she not say, "I know a Jedi," and she references Ahsoka. She's like, "Yeah, go. I know a Jedi. Here you go. Go find her." Yeah, so it's interesting. The rest of the galaxy views them as something, but I guess their self-identity is not. It doesn't reflect what everyone else sees. So that's very fascinating.
And I love that it transferred to the fandom as well, because there are constant battles about, is she a Jedi or not? It's like, who the hell cares? It's what is interesting is the conflict. It's not defining her as a Jedi or not. is the conflict between how others see her and how she sees herself. Another really interesting thing that I want to point out is this notion that we tend to call Ahsoka Tano Ahsoka, and we tend to call Asajj Ventress Ventress. There are exceptions, but it's really interesting how with Ahsoka Tano, we use the first name because there's sort of like more of a connection there, a more human connection. Ventress is an ominous figure, and so there is a distance that is created by using the last name rather than the first name. And we had talked about this before, and you talked about a few exceptions about this.
Yeah, I guess in Dark Disciple, her closure, her ending, she kind of comes to the light, and especially her relationship with Quinlan. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've read that book, but he refers to her as Asajj, and because they do have a close connection, obviously. But
yes,
yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I think during that story is kind of when we see that story in particular kind of gives her more relatability and more someone we can look for as before. She's just someone you don't want to mess with. And we see glimpses of that towards the end of Clone Wars.
Right.
Then the novel, I think, delves into it way more complexity of her character and her history. But yeah,
I love that we get to see Asajj Ventress's heart, that we get into sort of the emotional complexity of her character, both towards the end of Clone Wars and definitely in Dark Disciple, because she was always a character. She always felt to me like that character where the world was against her all the time. And she was strong enough to constantly say, fuck you, I am going to be here and I'm going to do my best to be something. And I love that fight against the world that Asajj Ventress has in it, because it makes her more complex. And it's sort of, by the end of Dark Disciple, my heart is broken.
Yeah.
And it's just really, really, really sad. And I find it really beautiful that somebody that we met as an evil character, as a villain, we get to that point. We get to that point that that we are feeling for Ventress in a very real way. Very real way. Once again, another moment in Star Wars that is not black and white anymore.
Right.
That it's not about the good guys and the bad guys. Like, the bad guys have issues as well, and they're fascinating and attractive issues.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That her story kind of just reiterates that theme that I always find very important in Star Wars, that anybody's redeemable, that the history, the choices doesn't define you, and that you can always flip a switch and make the right choice. I think that's very fascinating. We see that obviously with Vader, but she's another character where she makes a ton of bad choices, does a ton of bad things, and it doesn't forgive those or doesn't excuse those, but that there's always a little bit of something inside everyone that they can become redeemed. That makes sense.
I am not as nice as you. I don't think that everybody's redeemable. But
not everyone. Most people.
No, but your point is an important one, because Star Wars doesn't refuse a redeemable moment on a character that we had originally seen as simply bad or simply evil, and that I find really interesting. I've had some really interesting conversations with a lot of people about, can I actually forgive Kylo Ren for killing his father?
Right.
And that is a difficult question to answer for me. I really like what he does in Rise of Skywalker, but I haven't forgotten the end of Force Awakens. But in the case of Asajj Ventress, I think it's what you're saying is very real.
Yeah,
it's really very real, because we have gotten to a moment that we understand where her anger is coming from.
Right.
And I have no problem having a redeemable Ventress. I love Ventress by the end of Dark Disciple. I remember I kept having to take off my glasses to wipe up my tears because I couldn't see the words in the freaking book. It's like, no! Oh my God. It was like, it was a beautiful book. It was a beautiful book.
I remember getting to that end, and it's like, when you read a really good book and you kind of don't want to read anything else for a minute because you're trying to just take in what just happened. And
You're completely right.
after I closed the book, I was like, wow, I did not expect that. I take that back. I knew she was going to, I had been kind of spoiled before reading the book that this was her kind of closure, her end. So I kind of was, she's probably going to die. But I didn't expect her death to mean what it did when I read it. I thought,
I didn't know the end of the story. I didn't know that at all. So I was just blown away. Just really blown away.
It was not what I was expecting, and it was kind of like I said, I had to take a second and not read anything else for a minute just to process. And I was kind of like grieving in a way. I was like, I don't even know if I want to continue reading something else. That was just tragic. It was fascinating.
It is a wonderful book. It's one of my favorite books of the recent era. It's really, and it surprised me how much I liked it. I sort of read it, not dutifully, but sort of I was interested. I was interested because I like Ventress so much in the show, but I was not expecting to be blown away the way I was. I really loved it.
I was going to say I wanted to go back to her parallel with Ahsoka and how we were discussing how the novel kind of fleshed out Ventress and made her more complex than we had seen. But I think those seeds were planted, and Ahsoka's probably most famous story with the where she gets framed for bombing the Jedi Temple, and when she gets an unexpected ally in Ventress, and we kind of see those seeds planted that Ventress is not completely evil, that there is something in her that would call her to be good. And that to me is really where. And I know the Dark Disciple was intended to be an arc in the Clone Wars, and it never came to be, and so that's why it was adapted to the novel. But those seeds right there were planted, and that is kind of where their paths cross in the parallels. You start to see the parallels.
Yes.
That's where perfectly you see that both of these characters are, like you said, going through a strange, troublesome period throughout the galaxy in a full-out war that is very gray. There's no right or wrong. It's very flip a coin, and you could see who's right on any given day. And they kind of are victims to the factions they're involved in, with Ventress with the Sith, and then to a lesser extent Ahsoka with the Jedi. She mentions in an episode of Clone Wars that she is she was trained to be a Jedi, not a soldier, but all she's known is to be a soldier. That's all she's been her whole time as a Jedi. She's just fighting a war. And with Ventress, I think she says it in Dark Disciple that the dark side just takes and takes, and you're just searching for something that's never there. And that's kind of what the Sith do for her. They just use her until she's not useful anymore, and they cast her aside. And their conversation during that little arc where Ahsoka is very hesitant to accept her help, but she knows that the Ventress kind of realizes that me and you were not that much different. We've been on the opposite ends of things, but we're really more similar than you realize. And I thought that was very well done. So beautiful.
There's that moment, I think it's with Barriss, where Ahsoka and Barriss are talking about the war. And Barriss says something. Well, Mace Windu says that we are peacekeepers, and so what we're trying to do in the war is to sort of act as peacekeepers. And Ahsoka says something. I wish I could remember exactly what it was. But what happens at the end of the war? Do we continue being soldiers, or do we go back to peacekeeping? And what does that mean? Like, how are those two things going to reconcile themselves when the war is over? Because Ahsoka has always been a Jedi Padawan as a soldier. And so it's really interesting, her thinking about the future. When the war is over, what are we going to be? And so it's it's fascinating how, especially in the Ahsoka story, you get all of these moments of her sort of not questioning her world, but interrogating her world, sort of like wanting to understand what her position as a Padawan is, what her position as someone part of the Jedi Order is, which makes it so interesting when we meet her in Rebels, where she has sort of transformed herself into a rebel. And then we see her in The Mandalorian, sort of continuing the story of Rebels. And, you know, we're about to know at some point in the Ahsoka show what it is that she's going to do. And Thrawn is going to show up and I'm going to have a heart attack. But in The Mandalorian, it's really interesting how we get this almost like very calm Ahsoka. Like those scenes with Grogu, this is the wise Ahsoka. This is the this is Buddhist Ahsoka. When she needs to be badass, she is very badass. But I loved, you know, going back to the movie of Clone Wars, this feisty little 13-year-old girl is now an adult woman who is calm and controlled, and as smart as she was before, but with a sense of wisdom and experience that she didn't have when she was 13. I love that. I love that we get to see her grow.
You just made me think of it and kind of make this connection that, and maybe this was intentional when the way they wrote her in The Mandalorian, that when we see her, you know, for those that followed the Clone Wars and Rebels, we know her story, we know what she's been through. And so when we see her at that point, and like you said, she's very calm and very just at peace, it seems, with a lot of things. And of course, you know, when she needs to, she can, you know, pull out the sabers and do what she has to do, get the job done. But it's very fascinating. I think her experiences led her to where we find her in The Mandalorian, that she's been through a war, 2 wars. She knows, you know, some of the craziest things that have happened in the galaxy.
Wars, right? The rebellion, wars, right?
Yeah, she's kind of realized, and the galaxy's in turmoil, but they're supposed to be in peace.
Right.
But we see her that I think she has learned from those experiences, kind of like we were asking earlier with her conversation with Barris, what does it mean to be a peacekeeper when the war's over? And I think we kind of seeing that in The Mandalorian, that the war's technically over. So now she's just doing her best to maintain peace and kind of be that Jedi that she always wanted to be or should have been. The others just should have been maybe during the Clone Wars.
Yes, I think we should do a podcast called War and Peace.
Yes,
I mean, because we're starting to move in some really interesting conversations. Because The Mandalorian is all at peace. That's post Endor, and so it's just we should make a note. War and Peace podcast at some point.
I did want to say one more thing about Ventress. You know, seeing her, I kind of touched on it, but I didn't really get into it too much. That, and then I guess Ahsoka too, that have their parallels crossed. That trauma plays a big part in both of their lives, and kind of shapes who they become, and they go through similar experiences, but they take different paths. And you know, that's obviously who they're influenced by. You know, obviously Ahsoka with the Anakin and Obi-Wan and Yoda and the Jedi, and then with Ventress it's Dooku, and even some of the bounty hunters she ends up joining up later. It kind of influences, and Quinlan Voss to an extent, and it kind of influences where her story and her journey ends. But yeah, that trauma, and I think that's why I found revisiting some of Ventress's stories, and I listened to Dooku Jedi Lost recently, and I've kind of put into perspective that, you know, that the trauma that she experiences while, like we said earlier, she was just introduced as a clear cut, she's a baddie, she's a villain, don't trust her, stay away from her. But then by the end, we're saddened and just heartbroken that she's gone. I think in the Dooku Jedi Lost, I know you haven't got a chance to listen to it or read it, but throughout the story, she is experiencing Dooku's story with us, so she's learning about Dooku as we are, and she has in her mind, and it's not clear in the beginning, her old master Chimeric, that trained her as a Jedi. We hear his voice talking to her, and he's trying to put these seeds of doubt in her about, can't trust Dooku, do not trust this man, he's not great. he's going to use you, he's going to manipulate you until he gets what he wants, and then he's going to cast you aside, and which all those things end up becoming true. Uh, but it's kind of unclear when she's hearing his voice. Is it really him, or is she just kind of
Right.
in this mental state where she's all over the place? And by the end, we do find out that it was just all in her head, that she's just experiencing all this trauma, and that's kind of her way to cope with it. Because when she did have him, that was kind of her best years at that point, when she was at peace and she had a purpose. And then now she kind of doesn't know her purpose, and that everyone's dictating her purpose for her, and she just kind of feels at every point in her life, everyone has just used her talents and her abilities until they just don't have a use for her anymore. And I think when you look at it from a trauma perspective, somebody that's kind of been through that, you kind of understand why she is the way she is. It doesn't justify her actions, like I said earlier. It doesn't excuse them or anything, but it's much more understandable when you look at it that way instead of.
And it is I love that you use that word, because at the beginning of her story, we don't know the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So it's when we understand that there is a trauma that then Ventress becomes, then all the layers of Ventress start coming out.
Right.
And villains work as villains because we don't see the trauma, because we don't know that there's a trauma in there. We never get the childhood of Palpatine. Like, what happened when he was 5? What made him a Sith? All of that stuff. And so it's trauma is a really good word for Ventress. I think you hit it right on the nose there. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for the
force be with everybody, and we'll see you on the next podcast. But I can't speak. We'll see you on the net. We'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you, Nick. He speaks English. English is my second language. Bye, guys.